Hello, everybody. This is Super NES Podcast, episode number 140. I'm Greg, your host, as always, and and this is a special episode. I've been teasing doing this for a while now, and things have finally worked out all right to allow us to happen. I'm very pleased and honored to have my very first guest here on the podcast, who I'm going to be doing like an interview with. So I'm most humbled to be joined by a veteran game programmer. Somebody's worked on numerous computer systems over the years, going all the way back from the 2600 up to present games. I'm very pleased to welcome to the podcast Mr. Dan Kitchen.
Well, thank you, Greg. Thank you for having me. I'm honored.
Yes, definitely same here, sir. So, this is a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. I know you've done a lot of interviews recently. I kind of felt this interview kind of supplement those other interviews you've done very nicely. So I definitely will mention that toward the end of the podcast, so the podcast, so our listeners can have a chance to check those out, like for sure, as also. Was primarily focusing upon Super NES stuff here, but also wanted to ask you some more general-based questions.
Sure.
And just I understand it's been a long time, so your memory as it is just picking your brain as much as I can here. So, now to start off with, I know a lot of our listeners are going to know who you are, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that maybe a lot of our younger listeners may not be as familiar with you as some of our people like around my age are. So, if you don't mind, just kind of doing a quick introduction to yourself, maybe some of your best known games you worked on, that kind of stuff.
Sure, no worries. My name is Dan Kitchen. I was a designer at Activision in the early 1980s when soon after Activision left Atari. My brother and I joined Activision with a few other fellows, and we became their Eastern Design Center. At Activision, I had the opportunity to work with some of the best people in the business. Dave Crane from Pitfall Lore, of course, Gary Kitchen, my brother, is still a stellar designer. Bob Whitehead, one of the founders of Activision, and Al Miller, Larry Kaplan. These guys were really the people we looked up to and played their games. And when my brother and I were doing some of our early work in the late 70s and early 80s on the Apple II, and subsequently from that, my brother back engineered the 2600 and did Space Jockey and Donkey Kong, we were pretty enamored with Activision, their work ethic, and the quality of their titles, and had the opportunity to meet with them and eventually be hired by them. At Activision, I first released Crackpots for the 2600 and did a variety of other games, including Ghostbusters on the 2600, Kung Fu Master, River Raid 2. I helped do Commando and Kari Warriors, Double Dragon. And then for Atari, I did Crossbow. And eventually, a few years after that, with the second resurgence of the 2600 in the late 80s, I did F-14 Tomcat and worked on the My Golf title. So overall, I've done about 10 2600 games and then moved on to the Commodore and some of the subsequent platforms after that.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, definitely. You actually have a third brother who's a programmer too, right?
Yes, our older brother Steve never joined Activision, but he was a contractor to Activision, and he actually wrote Space Shuttle for Activision. Mm-hmm. And then for Coleco, he wrote Carnival, and then Donkey Kong Jr. on the 2600, and went off and did other coding after that for a variety of other non-consumer products.
That is such a weird quirk of fate to have like three brothers that all became like programmers.
It is, and we all got into it because my father was quite an enthusiastic electronics buff. He since passed away many years ago, but when he was in the 20s and 30s, he was very much into the wireless radios. In the 50s, he would build his own television sets. He would build his own radios. So we grew up in an environment where he was building television sets. We had oscilloscopes. We had voltmeters. He got us interested in electronics. And my older brother Steve, excelled very, very much. We actually had a computer in our old home back in the 60s that he had created out of discrete components.
Oh, wow.
And Gary was an incredibly gifted artist who was on his way to art school when my brother Steve, who was then working at a New Jersey-based engineering firm, offered Gary a job. And Gary is an incredible electronics engineer and also a game designer. And then I as well, when I left high school, instead of going to full-time college, I enrolled in night school and went to work with Steve as well. So that's kind of how the three of us got involved and eventually began working with each other in the late 1970s.
Yeah, that's definitely awesome. So are you the youngest of the three?
I am, yes.
Okay, all right, yeah, yeah. I mean, like, you hear tales about every now and then about maybe like like a father and son or two brothers working together, but they're working together in the same field, same company, whatnot. But three brothers, that's pretty, yeah, that's pretty like unique.
Yeah, we were very fortunate to be able to work together, all be interested in the same thing. And in the early 80s, Gary and I started to build a reputation with our games, and we were kind of referred to as the Kitchen Brothers. So some of our early interviews and magazine articles that we were involved in highlighted us as the Kitchen Brothers.
Yes, yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah, cool. It's very awesome. I mean, like, I mean, it's like, I grew up a little bit during those times. I mean, I remember a little bit. I was born in '76. I was like, so I was like 6, 7 years old during the heyday of the 2600 and whatnot. So, but I do remember. I do remember just how heaty those days were. I mean, this really was a time that this really was a time of like the bedroom programmer and like the 1 or 2 person teams who could make like successful games and whatnot. So, just yeah, fascinating time. And you guys were like really fortunate just to be alive and programming for everything during the thick of that stuff, I think.
Well, we were, and we were in fact bedroom programmers. I had learned how to program in '79 by getting my first Apple II and learning assembly language. Gary had done that as well, and I released my first game in 1981 through Hayden's Software Publishing, and it was a full paragraph recognition text adventure, not unlike the Zork series and those. So I did 2 of those in 1981, 82. But it was certainly the time where people like Bill Budge, an incredible talent who founded EA with a few other people. I mean, he wrote his first game that was a pinball construction set in his
bedroom. Yes, yep, yeah.
I'm fortunate to have a copy of that. And yeah, it was a time when we were really learning what gameplay was and how to do it, and all the hardware we had to custom make ourselves. Fortunately, Gary, Steve, and I are familiar with electronics, so we designed boards that we would help do the design and programming of our Atari games before we went to Activision. And fortunately, we were able to take care of the hardware part because there was no real hardware support. We had to create everything. And certainly there was no, schooling. I'm surprised now that people go to college to learn game design. Back then we were the ones trying to learn it and critique it, and we were the forefront of making it happen.
Well, you guys definitely were like, yeah, I was going to make this point later on, but this is a great segue. People like you and your brothers and the people who were around back then, you definitely were the foundational layers for the whole industry which exists nowadays. I mean, like video games is a huge industry, like even bigger than Hollywood is, as far as like the money it brings in every year. So, you guys deserve a lot of credit and recognition for laying the foundation for all that stuff. Because otherwise, a lot of people wouldn't have jobs today, or just successful careers if it wasn't for people like you.
It's funny. I was at a conference many years ago, and a woman walked up to me and kind of saw my name and her son was there, and she said, "You're the one responsible for my son playing all these video games and wasting his life away." And I said, "Well, ma'am, I'm also the one responsible for helping create a multi-billion-dollar industry. And perhaps your son and many other sons will have the opportunity to get employment in that industry." And that kind of shocked her, and she walked away.
Yeah, I didn't know what to say to that.
Well, I enjoy seeing all all the Facebook posts these days when we all have to stay locked in our homes.
Yeah.
And some of them are, I played video games all my life. I've practiced for this all my life, to stay in and play video games. So.
Yes, that is the popular meme going around like right now. That's for sure. So, so you said your first successfully published game was your game was on the Apple II, correct?
Correct. Yes, my first two games were released on the Apple II.
Yeah. I remember using the Apple II in school. That was my very first computer. That I cut my teeth on it. I remember that being like a very impressive system. I mean, for as far as the power it had back then and whatnot. I mean, it was expensive, but the games it could do on it were very impressive.
Yeah, it was. I think. Yeah, I mean, I think it ran at like a megahertz, maybe a little bit more. It had, if you could get it, it had 16K of RAM. That was a lot. And I know that they were very prominent in schools. From Apple, I believe, donating them. But yeah, it was a really crazy system to program, or I should say, to do art and graphics on, because it was a full bitmap screen. And we think of programming in an 8-bit machine. You've got 8 bits. Well, the problem is the screen of the Apple is really 7 bits per byte, and that was done because when Wozniak designed the board. I think it was cheaper and easier for him to do a PC board that didn't have that 7th bit addressing the screen as it should have. And so he did it a different way. And it was really a funky way to be able to do the artwork. And you only had different color patterns of bit nibbles that you could put up. So I think, 2 nibbles would give you purple and green, and then red and blue, and you could have white. And of course, the absence of anything was black. So it definitely has a distinct look. When you see an Apple game back then, it definitely has a very unique look to it because of that.
So I imagine that your experience programming with the Apple II helped a lot when you started making the transition over to the Apple. The Atari 100 later on, because I've heard from all the programmers just how difficult of a system that was programmed for.
Yes, and of course, learning 6502 was imperative because that was the common processor used, at least in the systems that I was interested in coding for. So 6502 on the Apple was 6502 on the 2600. You have 65816 on the Super Nintendo. Yes, back then it was an easy thing to leap over to the 2600. Certainly it is the most challenging console I've ever programmed for, and I really enjoy it because it's kind of like you're solving a puzzle every time you sit to work on it, particularly the display code. You've got no RAM except 128 bytes of zero page. You have no graphic RAM to speak of. And what you're actually doing is you're actually starting the TV raster to race across the screen, and you're dumping data into registers to be able to match it to the place where the TV raster is. And you do that 160 screens down the screen, 160 lines down the screen to be able to paint the screen of what the consumer is playing. And certainly, I think some of the background that we had in TVs that my dad had taught us, that actually helped because the 2600 really works on the raw knowledge of how a TV screen is created.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that helped a bit. But it's a unique machine. I love working on it. Back in the old days, we would work on it, and Activision was very particular. We had to do beautiful art. We had to do colorful screens. We weren't allowed to do any flicker. So we didn't flicker or any objects. We were very careful to only have 2 on a line. Whereas in the case you could have 2s with copies for things like Mega Mania. It was only you only have 2 objects on a line per se, but you've got multiple copies, so it gives the illusion of a lot of enemies that you're shooting at. And it's a very fun system to really cut your teeth on. because I think once you know how to do that, all the other computer systems that I worked on
Mhm.
seemed easier. And it's like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, so all right, so I have display lists in the 7800, or I have so and so in the Atari 400. That those were all much easier architecture to learn than the 2600.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if the 2600 was the most difficult system that you ever worked on, and I think you just answered that question. So,
It is. It is. Although I early on in the middle '70s, Gary and I were working with Steve at a development company, the engineering firm, where we got into the electronic toy business, and it was there that Gary designed and patented an electronic billiard game called Bank Shot.
okay, yep.
Um, and I had worked on Gary and Steve wrote code on, and I did engineering and technical work on a game for Parker Brothers called Wildfire that
Oh, yeah,
was
yep.
a handheld pinball game.
Yep.
And I ended up writing code for a number of those types of handheld games, and
Mm.
that was pretty challenging because back then we had no in-circuit emulator system, no ICE system. So you would an engineer would design a board and have maybe 4 or 5 1K chips or whatever the configuration was, and we would write code for a 4-bit microprocessor to basically strobe LEDs to be able to give the illusion that the ball was moving across the playfield in a pinball machine, or that the ball was hit and moving across a billiard table. And you literally had to program blind because you'd write the code, and then when you're done with an edit that assembled properly, you had to sit there and burn 4 EPROMs or 5 EPROMs, and then painstakingly stick them in the board and turn on the switch and see if the display lit up correctly. And if it didn't, well, you had no way to break point or trace or do anything. You'd basically make a printout and sit down and play computer and try to find the error in your code. And you'd take those 4 or 5 ROMs and put them in a UV lamp to erase them, and then you'd have to go on to the next edit, and then burn more EPROMs. And it was a long, arduous task to do that. It's kind of akin to using stone knives and bear skins. But so that itself was difficult, but incredibly rewarding. Because again, the 2600 for console systems was definitely the most challenging, and I enjoy it to this day.
Yeah, that's next. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Just hearing you talk about that because it's like I've read a lot of books and listened to a lot of interviews, view interviews by programmers over the years talking about things like that. And it's so mind blowing to me the fact that it took you guys so long and so much hard work to work on something that is really, at least by today's standards, like very simple. But it never really occurred to us at the time how simple it actually was because, like, those things were cutting edge for the cutting edge like the day. And it's like to hear you guys talk about how long it took and the process you had to go through. It's like, man, you could not pay me enough money to go through that crap. So it's like, it's like, yeah, it's like it's. The whole process. The whole process is just like amazing. Just to hear talk about it.
The challenging part wasn't just the time it took, but it was the constraints of the memory. For instance, when we were doing games back then, we had 4K of memory in the EEPROM. I think Gary did his first game, Space Jockey, in 2K, and inevitably, I wrote crackpots at Activision in 4K. But inevitably, as you write these things, it takes a while to get the display correctly because you're doing lots of things on the display. You may see a display of a game with mountains and cars and things like that, but on every scan line, there's a lot of things going on in the code that you have to constantly change the display and update it. And inevitably, when you're writing the display code, it looks great one day, you go and you make some changes, you turn it on, and oh my God, the mountains are all green, and they're upside down, and they're cut in two, and you've got to go and rewrite your display every time you want to add something in to that area of the game. And not only was the challenge to program the machine difficult, but the memory constraints were difficult because we would inevitably finish a game, and you'd have a 4K game, and when you're done, you were at 4.5K. Well, you can't sell that. You can't fit it in the ROM. So you would have to take time to sit there and cut a half K out of your code and figure out a way to rewrite the sections to make the game smaller and fit into the ROM that you allocated, because the price of memory was expensive. And so if they wanted to hit a certain price point, you couldn't just go and you got to get double the size ROM, because then you priced yourself out of the market with games sitting next to it on the shelf at a smaller price. So yeah, most of the time in these games, like the Atari 2600 games, I'd say a good 20% of the time was done at the end to literally cut bytes out of the code, rewrite things differently, but have them do the same thing so that you could fit it in for production. So they look simple, but they were pretty complicated.
Yeah, I've heard every programmer talk about that. Just the whole like Bane and the problem, the problem like trying to find somehow to squeeze a few bytes out of the code to make it fit onto 4K. It seems like everybody like struggle with that.
Yeah, so that's always a challenge, and that that was also fun. The whole machine is like working on a very complex puzzle, and it's really fun to do if you enjoy that.
Yeah, so just to talk about the handheld games, here again just for a moment, because it's like I remember that being a huge industry back then. Even though I was like so young, I do remember all the advertisements out there for the games, games out there, and like how big the industry was. Like I had a Wildfire as a kid, I loved it. I played that game through. Yeah, I definitely spent that thing like hours and hours. I use that thing for. So it's like I mean, like just to have. I mean, like that was really an amazing pinball like game, like a pinball game. It's just a machine to have your palm in your hand, and by today's standards, it's so simple. But it's like I was just hooked on that thing for so long because it felt like even though just LEDs, the pinball mechanics worked great in that game. I thought.
Yeah, they were. That was actually a design that was brought to Parker Brothers by an outside group who had a very rough prototype working, and they had hired the engineering firm where we were at to actually execute the game and get it playable and get it made, or get it to fit in the size of the processor that they wanted, which was one of the versions was an AMC, I think it was an AMI, 4-bit microprocessor, and then another version was on a TI microprocessor. And it was, the challenge was to make LEDs look and feel like physical balls. There's a real trick to doing that based on how long it stays lit in a certain area, so that it gives the illusion of gravity and that sort of thing, and how quickly it moves from light to light. And we worked a long time on making the games we were involved in feel lifelike.
Awesome. Like for sure. Like yes, I said, I just remember, I just remember how fascinating that it was. It was how great a machine that was, because I had a whole bunch of handheld games, but that was definitely my favorite to play.
Right.
Do you ever wonder maybe what might have happened if you'd stayed working in handheld games, like as opposed to transitioning over to console games?
Well, they had a big heyday in the late 1970s and in the middle 70s, and then to the 80s. And then about the early 90s, a lot of the work went over to Japan and China, mostly Japan. And I know that Tiger Electronics really came out as one of the big leaders in that. They moved away from LEDs, went to LCDs. I'm happy we stayed with video games, because as interesting as that was, the quality really went down when you got into the early 90s. Some of the Tiger games were respectfully not very playable.
Yes.
some of them were just license slapping on with a Disney brand or something. And clearly we knew that, video games was where it was at. Everybody had a TV set, and everybody wanted to play video games, or so we thought until the fall of 1983,
right? Yeah,
when the first crash came.
Right. So, Crackpots was your first Wizard game, correct?
Yes.
Playing that game, it's always struck me as kind of being like very similar to kind of like a reverse Kaboom. Did you have any inspiration?
I didn't.
Okay.
I've heard that many times, and yes, I can see where it is a reverse Kaboom. Actually, I wanted to initially move Potsy at the top of the screen with a with the paddle controllers, which certainly would have helped make it more like a Kaboom style product. But the paddle controllers, although released with the initial game system, um, weren't released in some of the follow-up versions of the 2600. And so I thought it would be safer to hit the largest installed base and use the joystick.
Right.
But yes, it definitely has a Kaboom, a reverse Kaboom feel to
it. So where did your inspiration for the game come from?
I recall that in the early days of the Eastern Design Center, we became very friendly with Dave Crane. We're actually still quite friendly. He still works with my brother now, and I speak to him often. I think, as I recall, he was out for a meeting at our Eastern Design Center in New Jersey, and we were in the town of Glen Rock where we worked, where we had an office. And I remember going to lunch and seeing some work being done on a scaffolding and watching a flower pot fall from a windowsill that one of the workers had knocked over. And it was just, one of those things where everybody likes to drop things from high distance and see what happens when they break. And I just thought, well, that's kind of cool. So let me go back and play with that idea. And I initially called the game Flower Power, and got it running and got it playable, and then into the hands of the Activision marketing people. I'm very happy with the name they picked and the story they picked around it, and thus became Crackpots.
Yeah, that's a great story. Like about the inspiration for it. That kind of reminds me about like David Crane's story, like about how he got the idea like to program like Freeway.
Yes, he was at the Consumer Electronics Show in June in Chicago, watching a guy dodge across, I think it was Lakeshore Drive, and that's what inspired him about that. Mine was kind of more of a Newtonian type thing, where he sat and saw the apple fall and said, gravity, let me do something.
So Crackpots came out kind of late in the 2600s.
It did. It came out right before the crash, actually.
Right. Do you ever kind of wish that maybe hindsight being what it is, do you wish do you wish things had aligned better so that you could have probably gotten involved in 2600 earlier, like during its heyday, as opposed to being involved toward the tail end of things?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. When we were at Wickstead, the company that did the design work for the electronic games, Gary had approached my brother Steve and his partner, whose name was Wickstead, and said, the Atari is a pretty popular system. I think we should do something with it. And that's when Gary went off and back engineered the system and learned how to program it and came out with Space Jockey. And then eventually I learned through his experience, and he taught me what I needed to know about the system. And yes, I do always wish that we were back earlier, because I think I particularly think some of my games would have done better at retail, because obviously when you had the crash and you walked into a store, and I remember doing this, we'd go to the stores all the time to see our titles. In the glass behind the counter, you'd see Crackpots or Pressure Cooker or one of our games. And then you'd turn around and there was a bin in the corner of Atari games selling for $2 or $5.
Yep.
And keep in mind, it wasn't the educated player who would buy those games. They were parents. And so parents would walk in and say, well, why should I spend $30 on Crackpots when I can come over here and get 5 games for $5 a piece, or 6 games for $5 a piece out of this little bin right here? Yeah. And it wasn't like the player walked in and said, I know what's better. It was really the parent who didn't know what was better and just picked up whatever they could that was affordable.
Yeah.
So
that was definitely my experience also, because my experience also, because I was only about 7 when the crash happened, but it's there were games I wanted, but my parents would buy me the cheap games because you can get 5 games for the same price as one of them. So
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
And and trying to be fair, some of those games were decent, but a lot of those games were just crap, unfortunately. So the crash was a very unfortunate thing, but but I'm glad at least that the industry at least evolved from that, learned lessons from it and whatnot.
It was a necessary thing. I remember the night Gary and I were in New Jersey in a town called Paramus, and we were driving through, and we stopped at a place called Video Shack, which sold videotapes and things like that, and they sold games. And I remember we looked up at the counter, and for the first time, we saw a non-Activision, non-Atari game, and it was Skeet Shoot by Games by Apollo.
Oh yes.
and that from subsequent shows through the years after that, I became friendly with Ed Salvo, who wrote that game and wrote a number of the games at Games by Apollo. But that night we looked at that, and Gary said, Dan, the industry is done. And he had a real good foresight to look at that and say, if this is what people are going to be manufacturing, we're dead, because the quality is so poor, but people don't know the difference, and everybody will jump out of their basement and make games for this, which is what happened, which is what brought down the industry.
Yeah, wow. That's an amazing observation. I've heard that before. Huh.
Yeah, he was quite prolific with his observation that, if this can come through and make it to a shelf, then there's going to be no quality control on anything. And that's exactly what happened.
So, speaking about the crash years, did you stay? So, what did you do for employment during those lean years? What stuff were you working on?
We were still employed at Activision. As a matter of fact, that kind of curtails into the story of my current 2600 game. But we can leave that for the end of the show. But they immediately took us off the 2600 games we were writing and creating, and they wanted us to focus on more computer-oriented products. So Gary worked on, I think his first game was Designer's Pencil. That was not really a game, but a wonderful tool. And then I had worked porting that game to the Apple II. And then we focused on games for the Commodore 64 and for the Apple, because everyone was kind of moving away from the Atari 2600 and going to the computer games.
Yep.
Which we had already cut our teeth on before Activision, all the way up until, of course, Nintendo showed up with a little box, a little man named Mario, which changed everything.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry. Just in a comment, I'm definitely one of those people too, because my parents finally got me a computer. My first computer that they bought me was a Commodore 128D, which is basically like an improved 64,
right.
Essentially. And compared to my earlier consoles, there was no competition. That system just blew it away. It's I'm biased, but to this day I still love that Commodore system. But
it was a great system. We enjoyed it. We worked on a number of games for it. I really enjoyed that system.
Right. So, so you mentioned Mario a moment ago. So I guess I can Super Mario Brothers when that came out.
Yeah, right. Super Mario Brothers. Obviously, it was incredible design by Miyamoto, and he hit it out of the ballpark. He's a genius, and it was the birth of the platformer. But more importantly, it was the rebirth of the video game business. And everybody, I remember during the time, a lot of business people, a lot of the suits at game companies that we worked with were very adamantly against Nintendo's policies.
Yep.
Because they created the system, and every game you did for them, you had to sign up as a licensee. You had to get the game approved. You had to let them manufacture the game only, and they allocated how many cartridges you could buy. And it doesn't matter if you had the rights to, say, The Simpsons, which Gary and I did in 91, 92, and, Acclaim had the rights and we did it for them. And if they had sales of 1 million cartridges they could sell, doesn't mean they could get 1 million cartridges from Nintendo, because everybody wanted cartridges, and Nintendo was allocating their chips for each cartridge. And so they may say to a publisher, well, we can only give you 200,000. And they did that. They allocated the chips. They were very strict on who got how many games to sell. They were very strict on the quality of the games. And a lot of people complained in the head offices of the game businesses and said it was, an infringement on monopolies. They were running a monopoly. They can't do this. But I firmly believe, and as a matter of fact, that that they single-handedly resurrected the video game business because it had to have control, it had to have quality control, and it had to slowly win back the respect and the assurance of the buyers at the stores that they weren't going to get stuck with another mess of millions of cartridges.
Right.
And so they slowly brought back the feeling of confidence from the buyers and from the consumers, and their first party quality was amazing. And I think in those early days when they learned how many games came out and what they were slowly and methodically rebuilding the business, and that's really what brought it to what it is today. They're really solely responsible for the resurgence and growth of the video game business from that point forward with Mario and the 8-bit NES system.
So I always find it curious also. Like, I know you did some work on some NES games, but how did you get roped in doing stuff for 2600 again?
It's interesting. And I kind of thought this would happen. When in the late 70s, you're playing the 2600 and your little brother or sister, you don't want them to play with you. So, by the time the crash happens and it isn't cool anymore, you throw it in your closet. Well, eventually your little brother and sister grow up and now they want to play with it. So that's what happened in the middle 80s, about 86, 87, 88. There was a resurgence. We were selling games and we were working at Activision up until 86. Actually, we just had left Activision and formed our first design firm called Imagineering after our love for everything Disney. And we were doing games and we were beginning to sell games on our own to people like Toys R Us. And the buyer from Toys R Us came back to us and said, hey, I get customers coming here wanting new Atari 2600 games. Can you do them? And we were like, well, yeah, it's been a number of years. So we, at least at Imagineering, created a label called Absolute Entertainment, where we started to write new 2600 games. And they started to sell at retail. So Dave Crane wrote Skateboarding, and a chap I worked with wrote Title Match Wrestling, and I wrote F-14 Tomcat Flight Simulator. And then I ended up writing I think it was for Activision at that late time. It may have been Ghostbusters, but that may have been earlier. I did do Crossbow for Atari. And I think later on, around that time, I did Kung Fu Master for Activision because they wanted to get back into the 2600 business as well. And so we had a little resurgence back in the middle to late 80s. Which was very pleasantly surprised by everyone. And, we made a good living out of those games that we did, that second round of games.
Yeah, it kind of seems a little bit strange in hindsight thinking about it, but also the fact that I also realized that, because they, even though I was just a kid back then, I do remember how expensive NES games were. So, Atari games did offer, a cheaper way for people to be able to play games and whatnot, even the quality wasn't quite as good. Because it was just because it wasn't just Activision making new Atari games.
Right.
Intellivision also had some late games come out during this time period too. So it's
Right.
These older systems that were cheaper. Like you said before, the younger brothers and sisters playing them and whatnot, because you can get a game for half the price like what an NES game was selling. So
Right. And of course, it was years later. The price of the memory chips were cheaper, and so Crossbow I did for Atari was a 16K game. Couldn't have been conceived of when I was doing Crackpots. It was just the chips weren't available and the cost was too high.
Right.
But obviously, 4 or 5 or 6 years later, the price of the silicon came down, and you were able to get bigger chips for less money.
No.
And so that also helped the whole 2600 resurgence. And they were cheaper because Nintendo had a very high OEM cost to us. But they were the premium game. They had a good quality, and people would pay for that. So all of us made money, including Nintendo. And so any alternative like the new Atari games would be a more of a value price for the consumer. But it was okay for the younger brother who if you can't afford a SNES game or a NES game.
Yeah. I was actually going to ask this later on, but this is a good point to bring it up. So during this resurgence of 2600, like you worked on a lot of like arcade ports. There must have been obviously I'm sure there are unique challenges in trying to handle trying to handle like an arcade port as opposed to making an original game from scratch. So
Certainly, yes.
did you find it enjoyable to work on a port as opposed to original game?
I did. You know, I was still writing code for the Atari, but it is much more of a challenge, and because you have to try to stay true to the actual machine arcade version. It was a challenge on Double Dragon. That was definitely a challenge to get that to work. Akari Warriors was a bit easier.
Yeah.
Commando was easier. Kung Fu Master was interesting because when I wrote Kung Fu Master, I actually had an NES sitting on my desk with the NES version of Kung Fu Master, which I really liked playing.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so I didn't really use the arcade port, the arcade as a reference. I really used the NES version. But yes, it's more challenging because you have to stay true to the original game, and the original game being an arcade machine, which has custom hardware that can be, created as the programmers needed, was challenging when you had a limitation and you had to create it on a game that was made to play Pong and combat.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, it had its own unique challenges, and I enjoyed them. I enjoy writing a game at 2600, whether it's an original or an arcade port.
Yeah, yeah. Like it always amazes me the fact that the 2600, as you just mentioned, was a system created in the late 70s to basically just play 2 or 3 games, and then like over 10 years later to see games like late games like your Atari ports, and also things like Solaris and and whatnot in the system. It's like damn. It's like I cannot believe this. I cannot believe that this old girl's it's like pulling off this complicated stuff. It's like
right.
It was just something amazing.
Yeah, Dave Crane always tells the story, and he was the master of learning how to make that machine do things it wasn't supposed to. He tells the story about sitting in the Atari lab, and the gentleman who actually created the TIA chip that is involved in it and the chipset walked by his cubicle one day, looked at his screen, and said, "Wow, I didn't know my hardware could do that." And just shows that, fortunately, it was not so much a closed system, but fortunately, the way the hardware was designed to make it cheap and to make it at a very good price point to the consumer, I think it allowed us to do some funky things with the chipset and the timing of the screen raster that you may not have necessarily done if they had made it more of a complex machine. The simplicity of it, I think, gave us the versatility to do some things with the hardware that it wasn't meant to do.
So speaking about David Crane and ports, you worked on the 2600 version of Ghostbusters,
Yes.
which was a game that David Crane originally wrote for the Commodore 64. I love that game. Like some of my favorite games. I've apologized to him since then because of the fact that I had a borrowed copy of the game, but but in my defense, I was a kid, so like I didn't really have the money to go out and buy new games. So
Yes.
I since tried to make amends for that. But So did David Crane help you at all? Like in doing that port, because that's a very impressive, I think at least, a very impressive effort on the system, very close to the actual computer game.
Yeah, thank you. No, I did the port in a very short period of time, about 3 months, because they had to have it done for Christmas, I think, that year. I had some help internally in my office with music. I think the music was written by one of the guys. Mm-hmm. Gary, I think, helped a little bit of some of the code on the map screen. But I pretty much did the whole thing and ended up burning myself out for a few months afterward because of the amount of overtime I spent getting that game done. But I'm very happy with it. It came out well.
Yes, it did. I've always said to my friends like the fact that like this version of the game is super playable. It's almost as good as the original Commodore version because it's so much better than like the NES version, which should have been better because that was a superior system. But it just kind of goes to
right.
but it just goes to show like how, but it just goes to show like just what just what a skilled programmer like yourself can do, who knows the hardware, the hardware, and can just like wring the best out of it to handle a game like that. So yeah, super impressive. So actually, all your arcade ports I thought were I thought were excellent too, except for Double Dragon. I do have to admit. That one's pretty rough.
It is, and I can tell you that I did less code writing on that and more production. We had a new programmer in our office who actually took the bulk of that, and I was actually working on another game at the time. So I produced it with him. I helped write some of the screen displays. But yes, if I had focused full time if I had written that by myself, along with games like Commando that I was involved in and Atari Warriors that I was involved in, I think they would have come out more to the quality of my games that I single-handedly. But I still think the effort was wonderful. They did great jobs on those games, and people love them and play them today. I was fortunate enough to be involved and really oversee the development from an executive producer's standpoint, and to write some of the code for those games, and to write the displays and to help them along as they were doing the systems. But yes, I can see that it's not the best port of Double Dragon, but it is pretty good for a system that has one button.
Oh yeah, sure, definitely.
And again, was made to play Pong and combat. So.
Right. Yes, definitely. So.
Yeah.
So that brings us right. Yes, that brings us pretty nicely right to the early '90s. So like, where were you working like in your career during the late 91, 92 time period?
We had left Activision in '86, and we were in a little office, and that was actually under a dentist. We were in a basement office.
Oh God!
in a little town called Midland Park, New Jersey, and we had moved a few years after that to an office in Glen Rock, New Jersey, right by a railroad track, which I thought was fun, being a railroad enthusiast. So I was working in Glen Rock, New Jersey, at a little office in Glen Rock, and doing NES games. I was overseeing the production at that time, of Swamp Thing, which was one of the games we were doing. I was overseeing the production of Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. I had, these were NES games. I had written Firehouse Rescue, which was a Fisher-Price game that one of our clients brought to us. I was working on Ghostbusters 2 at the time, and that's where I would have been really stuck in the NES world.
Yeah, so I know during this time period like during the NES, Super NES years, you like were transitioning more into a producer role as opposed to like programming directly. How did you feel about that?
Yeah, I would have liked to have gotten more hands on the Super Nintendo, but we had expanded. We had some really good programmers, and there was more of a need for us, instead of focusing on one game for 6 months or 8 months, we found that we could take that creativity and oversee the production of 3 or 4 or 5 games and help make those really good. And so it was a decision we made to somewhat transition from writing a game into overseeing and producing a line of games. I was still fortunate enough to be writing NES games, but things like the Super Nintendo, I was more in designing the game and then working on whatever production or design help was needed from that standpoint,
right,
as opposed to actually writing in 65/816.
Okay. So do you remember your first time seeing a Super NES and playing one?
I do. We had one we purchased we actually got a family con. There was a place in New Jersey that was a Japanese store down in Edgewater, and Matsui, I think it was called. And we were able to buy cartridges and games from Japan that were sold there before the U.S. versions came to the States. And so we had a Famicom, and I think the first game I saw was Pilot Wings, if I remember.
Ah, okay. Yep.
And that was an incredibly fun game, just to be able to land on the right place. And I think that was probably one of my first NES games that I played.
Hmm.
Or Super NES game.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So I know you said, like, I know you said, like, so I know you just said that you didn't actually program anything directly with Super NES, but you did have a chance to tinker around with the hardware like a little bit.
Yes.
What did you think about the architecture, and the processing power of like the system?
It was wonderful compared to the NES. I mean, plus, you had more instructions with the 816 that you could do cool things. I really wish I had sat down and had the opportunity to actually do a game. I was slated to do some work with Gary on Super Battle Tank, but at the time it wasn't really needed, and he was the king of that, having done the NES version. So he went and did Super Battle Tank by himself, and I was involved in taking the the F-14 game I had done and wanted to make a Super Nintendo version. And so that's really where I started playing around with until we had hired a chap who was an incredible programmer, and made more sense for him to get the most that he could out of the system, and I'll sit in the background and do the design, and create the screens and work with the artists on what the art should look like, and create the scenarios of what bogeys came out where and the mission copy, and really bring the game together.
Right.
So that was my forte in the Super Nintendo games.
So this is Turn and Burn you're talking about, right?
Yes, that's right. Turn and Burn, No Fly Zone.
Yeah, that's a very impressive game. I actually played that recently. I actually played that recently. Recently, like first time. Unfortunately, the Super NES has such a big library that just like the NES and the NES, the NES like 2600, that there were a lot of good games that just fell through the cracks, unfortunately, because they didn't get like the wide scale media attention or publishing push or whatever. And I think this game is one of them. This game is really very good, I think. And for anybody who enjoys games of this type, that really didn't get the attention that should have, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. It did okay at retail, but we were releasing the game into a large competitive base of other titles. Right. And from there, I had helped produce and design the Ren and Stimpy game, which was Vidiots.
Right.
And that was actually a contract job we had done for, I believe it was THQ at the time.
Right.
And then we had done a Sega Genesis game based on Goofy with Disney. And they had offered us, after Goofy, the rights to Home Improvement, because they had these rights and they wanted to see if there was a way to monetize them with a game.
Right.
So they flew us out. We got a chance to meet Tim and go to one of the tapings and meet the cast and kind of sit and brainstorm a little bit. And then we went back to New Jersey and said, it's not always fun to replicate reality, because reality is not fun. People play games to escape into dungeons and go in rocket ships and to fly in space and do things instead of walking around the living room. So it wouldn't be really fun to be on the set of a Tool game, but we envisioned, how about making it on the back lot where we were, with all these sound stages, and over there they're making a prehistoric movie. Over there they're making, and right. So you get involved in wandering these sound stages on a back lot, and so that was the concept that Disney liked. And from there we created Tim's Tool Time Home Improvement game.
Yeah, I played that game like a while ago, like several years ago, and man, that is a weird game. But
it was certainly a reach, I can tell you that. When they came to us and said, make a game out of power tools,
yeah,
you could do it today more easily, because we used to sit in the old days and say, wouldn't it be funny if there was a game, and we would joke, a game about managing a restaurant. And so people come in and you got to put them in seats, and then you got to take their orders. And we would joke about, well, that's not really a game. We'd laugh it off. And of course, you have, Cooking Mama and all these other games that do really well now. Sims. So sure, you could probably evolve a very cool power tool game in this time period, but back then it was really all about video games
Yeah.
and arcade games. So
Right. So you did a lot of work during the NES Super NES days, like in trying to make games based out of like trying to create games based out of like existing licenses, like Home Improvement, Simpsons, etc. I've heard it's a very difficult project to do because you're under severe constraints about trying to get approval for all your stuff, flavor stuff, and whatnot. How are your experiences were like trying to like make games based upon those already existing and popular licenses?
it is always a challenge because you are under the restriction of the licensor. Um, the most interesting story I had has to do with the Goofy game. We acquired the license from Disney, and we were creating a Super Nintendo game. And we signed the game, and we started creating it. And about 3 months into development, Disney representatives came out and wanted to take a look at the progress. And we showed them, the game had to level up with Goofy walking around doing things. And, they said, the backgrounds are beautiful. They said, but Goofy is not very fluid. And, Disney animation has to be very fluid. A lot of squash and stretch and squishing. And we knew that. So I said, okay. I said, we would love to create the character like you did for Aladdin, where, Disney Aladdin on the Genesis was done by David Perry, and they had a group of Disney hand animators sitting at their animation wheels, creating these hand-drawn animations and making Aladdin look amazing and all these characters. So I said, may we have access to that? They said, well, what we need you to do is we need you to make Goofy look like Aladdin and use hand-drawn animation techniques to do this. But we're not allowed to have any of our animators work with any third-party people. So no, we can't give you any Disney animators, but we want you to make it look like Disney animation. So that was a challenge. That was probably the most difficult. That was like, okay. Fortunately, as Providence would have it, one of my artists, an incredible artist by the name of Tom Toby, who's still in the industry, Tom had gone to a school in New Jersey called the Joe Kubert School of Animation. And there he learned original animation, hand-drawn animation technique. Well, one of his teachers that he introduced me to, that I became a good friend with, was a chap called Milt Neal, who was in his 80s. Well, Milt was one of the original animators at Walt Disney. Milt worked on Dumbo. He worked on The Three Caballeros. He actually created the image of Howdy Doody for the Buffalo Bob show. So he was at Disney, I think, for about 10 years during the 40s, and really knew how to make. This was a Disney animator. This is the guy who drew Dumbo. So, how can you get much better than that? So I was very happy to get acquainted with Milt, and we became good friends. He passed away a few years later because he was quite old. But we actually did a number of animation frames for Goofy. And Milt did all the keyframes, and my friend Tom did all the tweening and all the in-between frames. And we scanned them in by hand, and we fixed them up art-wise, and we made them really beautiful. And about 2 months after our initial meeting, Disney flew out to want to see the progress. So they kind of flew out, and we sat them in our conference room. I flicked on the switch and said, here you go, take the controller. And they were floored. They said, how in God's name did you get this to look so Disney-like? And I said, well, you told me to get a Disney animator, and you give me one, so I found one, just like 30 minutes down the road. And they were amazed. Some of them had heard of Milt, and they were amazed that he was located in New York, that we had found him to help us make the game look better. So, but in other cases, most of the games we did that were licensed games, we were hired to do. While we had Absolute Entertainment, our publishing company, in the early 90s, still. That was our publishing label that we put out games to Toys R Us under our own name, and we sold directly to the stores. But we still had Imagineering, which was our development company. And people like Game Tech and THQ and Acclaim and other companies would come to us to make games for them, and they would often come with a license. like Acclaim did. They said, "Hey, I have the rights to The Simpsons. Have you ever seen it?" And yes, we did see it, and we were fortunate enough to do 4 or 5 Simpson games for them. And in those cases, yes, you always had to work within the constraints of a licensor. Some were easier than others, but that was always something that you were fighting to maintain the
Right.
quality and the requirements of the licensor. So it added another level of stress and another level of difficulty and sometimes delay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So talking about companies, you had dealt with Nintendo previously already back in the NES days, and you would deal with Nintendo again later on for later systems. What was your experiences doing with Nintendo like during the Super NES period, as far as trying to work with them to get games released, like whatnot? Like, were they easier than in the NES days to deal with, or what?
Yeah, we always thought they were wonderful. We had a great relationship with all the tech people there, with the people at LockCheck, with the people at the QA department. We had a good relationship with the management. Gary, my brother, knew Howard Lincoln well. I think we even met Arakawa, who's over from Japan. Yeah, we always thought they were a very wonderful group to deal with. So we had no complaints whatsoever. They were just great.
Oh, okay, cool. So out of the Super NES games that you oversaw the production of, like, is there one that's a particular favorite of yours that you have a soft spot for?
Well, I would probably have to say it would definitely be Turn and Burn, because I have a love of aviation.
Right. Yep.
And of course, I worked about that time period with a group which was located in the East Coast called the Confederate Air Force. And what we would do is we would fly into air shows on B-17s and B-24s and B-25s. And I would work with the crew on these World War II aircrafts and fly them in. And then we would hop out of the aircraft in military garb, World War II uniform, and give people tours and speak to the veterans and be involved in whatever the aircraft was involved with for the day. So I had a love of aviation, military aviation. And so I'd say Turn and Burn was probably my favorite. I worked on Casper, which was a small, low-budget game for high-tech expressions. That was kind of fun. It wasn't really a game we had a lot of time to do, so it wasn't a very good design. We had literally a couple of months to do. It was an unfortunate opportunity where we got the rights, or we got the project from the company way too much later than we should have. And there are games that I had worked on that, back then, the mentality was to make games hard.
Yes.
And I look back at some of the Activision games, which I think are incredible games. But you put in something like Mega Mania, and you will be lucky to get around the first objects before, I don't think I've ever made it to the 4th line of objects. There's 8 of them, I think, or 6 or 8. And then, they get really increasingly difficult the next time around. And then the next time after that, they're really freaking hard. Like Chopper Command, you get by 3 waves of the enemies and you're up to 10,000 points, but then it gets super, super hard.
Right, yeah.
And I thought some of those games would do well if the ramping up was less hard during the ramp up. So you had more time experiences to play the game, more time to enjoy it. And some of our Super Nintendo games, like Home Improvement, like Ren and Stimpy, particularly Rocky and Bullwinkle, which I loved working on and designing or co-designing with one of the guys in the office. We back then we made some of our games too hard, and they haven't held well to the test of time because of it.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because that's probably, as you may be aware of, that's an ongoing debate these days about because a lot of people like around my age who grew up playing games our whole life. A lot of them, not myself personally, but a lot of people complain that games these days are too easy. But the way I argue is the gaming base is so much bigger these days. I mean, back then you only had a small dedicated group of a group of people buying and playing games, and they expected tough games because, A, they're used to playing games, B, games were expensive and they could only get games like once every few months or so you want a tough game that would last for a while, keep their interest. Nowadays there's so many games out there. Games are so cheap, games are plentiful. And also the base of people who play games has expanded so much. It's like, like nowadays in hindsight, like maybe like, yeah, we made those games too tough, but I also argue like, that was the times that you guys programmed for, and there wasn't anything wrong, and there wasn't anything like wrong with it because those were the like you made the games to cater to people who were gaming back then. So,
Right.
It's interesting you say that because I'd agree the games are hard, but I wouldn't say they're the hardest games out there. Period.
Right.
Just the period it's programmed for.
Right, and they were the quote core gamers then. I mean, they were mostly male demographic. They were mostly teenagers or younger, and they played the games. And yeah, they were expecting hard games because I think they were core gamers. They were used to playing games, and now you do have such a broad-based audience of teens and women, and not that women don't play games really well, but you have more of a general audience for older players, for people my age, people older than me, grandparents are playing, and other people are playing all these different types of games. I think you have to make them easier so that people can enjoy the experience more so. And that was a time period of Twitch games. You were jumping, you were pressing that button, you were trying to maneuver every slight part to get the mushroom or get whatever you were getting from Mario. And it was really, really Twitch games, and now you have a whole selection and genre of them that are easier. It may seem, I've had time to reflect over the years and thought, some of those games that I produced or programmed, I could have made easier. And in hindsight, I'd like to go back and make them. Look, they stand the test of time nonetheless.
Yeah, definitely. So, do you remember? Were there any games or projects that you guys worked on for the Super NES during this time period that maybe didn't come out, or only got only got half finished or prototype stage or anything like that?
We had some games in the lab. I have more of that on the Atari side. I had 3 games on the Atari side. That one was half finished. One was completely done that I don't have a copy of that I could do something with today. And then there's the Keystone Capers 2, which we'll discuss later. On the NES, we had tinkered around with some other military-style games and some other platformers we were playing with. But, for the most part, during that time period, we were always busy with games for other publishers. So we didn't have a lot of time to sit and play around with the system and create games that we would get halfway through and not finish.
Right, yeah.
One game that I worked on with a programmer was based on Family Dog, which was a Steven Spielberg, cartoon that I think only lasted a season.
Right, I remember it.
And we worked with Amblin on that, and then I consequently worked with Amblin years later on a PC game based on the Casper movie, I think from the 90s, with Bill Pullman and Christy Ricci, I think, was in it. So we had a chance to work with Amblin on Family Dog. They were wonderful people. They were very creative. And I think it was a very well-executed game and very close to the brand. Very honored the brand well. But it's certainly a game that, for all intents and purposes, I don't know if people know even exists.
Right, yeah.
So, yeah.
Speaking about obscure games, the last Super NES game we haven't mentioned yet was the Rocky and Bullwinkle game, and it's like I remember watching that cartoon as a kid. That cartoon was around for a long time. It's like the fact you guys actually made a game based on that in the early '90s when the cartoon was no longer in production was just amazing to me.
Yeah, Jay Ward had done that. I grew up watching that in the '60s and '70s. I loved Rocky and Bullwinkle, and it was just one of these trade shows. I think the licensing show we were at where we were looking for brands to create games for, and that came across our desk, and the price was right, and it was kind of an older title. I don't even know if I think Cartoon Network was out then. They may have been playing it on some of the cable channels. It was still on rerun. Um, but yeah, that was a funny story with that. Is I remember we signed the license and I had to do the design of the. And I remember that a day when I accumulated all the videotapes of the Rocky and Bullwinkle show, and I spent like 10 hours watching every tape
Wow.
and watching every episode. It was a lot of them. I don't know if I got through it all in that one day, making notes on what I could use in the game. And I remember that night went out to dinner with my accountant and his wife, and so we're in a fairly nice, expensive restaurant. And so he's talking about his M&A that he's doing, that, and the people he's meeting, and the issues he's having with the mergers department, that and all. And then he looked at me and said, "So how was your day? What did you do today?" And I just sat there and smiled and said, I just spent the last 10 hours watching the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon, and that's all. And his wife kind of looked at me like, mine, until she realized what I did for a living. It was a pretty funny comment to make, quite a posh setting. But yeah, it was a game that I really liked. I designed it with another fellow at the office who was also an enthusiast on Bullwinkle. We also did a Game Boy for that a few years earlier, which is an interesting story that I had a friend who was an artist at the company, and he had a friend who was an artist in the ad agency. And he would do ads on billboards and stuff. And we saw his work and we said, "Dude, your stuff is really good." I said, "We think you should try to get into the game business and try to get into doing art for games." And he said, "You really?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "You should really do that." So we hired him, and his first game was Rocky and Bullwinkle Game Boy. And he did great artwork and worked with us for maybe 7, 8 years after that. And he consequently went to California and went to work for, I think, Sledgehammer. And he eventually became the gentleman who ran the Call of Duty games for Activision. His name is Glenn Schofield. Glenn was one of my artists that I hired in probably 1989 or 1990, who his friend was working for us, and we saw incredible promise in his art, at least the hand stuff he was doing, and said, "You want a computer?" And so we kind of broke him into the game business, and he and I worked on Rocky and Bullwinkle. I remember that we worked on Rocky and Bullwinkle, the Game Boy, and he did an excellent job, and he as well was an enthusiast of Rocky and Bullwinkle, so he was also involved in Nintendo.
Oh, cool. So, awesome. Yeah.
Just a little sideline, how somebody came into the business and I had the chance to work with him, and he's gone off and done such incredible monumental work since then.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, definitely. I've heard definitely, just how, despite how big it is, I've heard numerous stories like about how close and tight knit that the game community, as far as programmers, designers is even like this day, about how many folks know one another or worked with one another in the past or whatnot, and it's like always cool to hear about.
Yeah, it's very cool I get people sometimes out of the blue. There was a chap I was looking to do some contract work with my current company, and I ran across a guy who, as an artist at Activision, at Absolute, in the early 1990s, and he is now running a development studio, and it was just amazing to say, "Hey, I remember you. We used to work together in that Glen Rock place, remember?"
Yeah.
It's just a lot of fun to run into people you worked with so many years ago.
So something else about Rocky I was just thinking about, and this probably will apply to other games too, but it's like, like when you're actually programming or thinking about thinking about making designs for games, whatnot. You mentioned doing research by watching by watching all the Rocky episodes. I remember there being a Rocky game, also the Rocky and Bullwinkle game that came up on television as well. Did you ever play past games based upon based upon franchises or ideas to see maybe get an idea of what worked, what didn't? Make sure you didn't copyright infringe or ideas or anything else like that.
Oh, sure. Yes. I mean, I do that, to this day in different genres, and I'm actually involved in board game design for tabletop games, and I do the same thing. Look at games in a similar genre. But sure, we would look at a game. Back then, like doing The Simpsons, there weren't any Simpsons games. You play other platformers,
Right.
get an idea what worked, what didn't. I don't recall playing the Rock television game, but yes, we could when possible. We certainly would look at competitive games and see what worked and what didn't work, and not to plagiarize them, but to get a feel of, well, I was thinking about maybe the aircraft would move this way or this way in this kind of situation. Let me see how they did.
Mm.
See if they pulled it off, or maybe look at how they executed some gameplay that I could now learn that how to build on that
Right.
in my product. So yes, we certainly did that. Not in the case of Rocky and Bullwinkle, but certainly in other games.
Yeah. So, I guess so. Actually, that's a great point. Just kind of like talking about playing games because um, yeah, because you've always been you've always enjoyed playing games as much as programming them. Like, correct?
Correct. Yes.
So I know some programmers just pretty much do it like for it's kind of strange, but I've listened to interviews with other programmers who've been like, well, I like programming, but I never actually like play the games, or and it's like and I was struck as being like, it's so strange that you're working on one side of the industry, but you're not even touching the other half of it, because it's like how can you get a sense of what actually works as a gamer if you're not actually like involved involved like at the side of the table. Because it's like you have to kind of have perspective as to what makes a game fun to be able to work on it, I would think. So
You do. That is certainly, yeah, you do have to play games, particularly on this console or in the genre that you're trying to create. You want to see what worked and you want to learn about the competition, but just get a feel for the immersion that puts you in that type of game, because you want to capture that. You want to capture that passion, or that feeling of what players enjoy about that title. I'm a very passionate creator, so I would write 2,600 games if I couldn't sell them today, just because I love creating, and so I love doing that. But you're absolutely right, and I found in my career other people in the companies that I worked with who knew what played really well, separate from the programmers, were the game testers.
mm,
And in my career, I was able to elevate a number of game testers to the position of game producers, simply because they played so many games, and they played our games, and they just played so many games in general, that they knew what made a game fun or not.
right.
And so it's interesting that they spending all that time actually, in many cases, helped promote them to a better position in the industry.
Yeah.
And I found that they certainly were a wealth of knowledge when I went to them and said, this kind of work, what have you seen in other products? And if I had played the game, most assuredly one of them did.
Yeah.
That was a competitor product. So.
Yeah, that's a great point made about game testers, because it's like, I have a friend who used to work in that field, and like, I'm sure it's very different now compared to like back then, but it's like, so with a game tester, like you're playing a game like you're playing a game like for so many hours, like you probably know it inside, outside, and better than even the programmer does at that point, because of all the time and effort that you're putting into it. And it's like, people kind of think that game testing is an easy job. It's not. I mean, my friend could tell you,
No,
it's like,
not an easy job.
yeah, it's a lot of long hours, little pay, and not much reward. But yeah, the skills definitely could come in handy. Could come in handy later on if you want to like move up in the career field. So,
And you're trying to play the game differently than the way it should be played.
exactly, if they're trying to break
Their
it.
job is to break it, right? Right. Go and do the things that it wasn't made to do. Jump at the time that it wasn't expecting you to jump. Go to that corner of the screen and do things that you're not usually going to do as the player, to see if you can find a problem in the code that would cause a bug, or ultimately a crash, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yep. And, like, even all the work they did, I mean, like, like nowadays it's insane, but it's insane. But even back then, the Super NES days, it's like but it's like almost every game has like even though it got released and tested professionally and whatnot, there's still like bugs, ways to break the game, glitches, that kind of stuff that slip through the game testers. So it's like I'm more tolerant about like finding bugs in modern games because it's like, well, the scale about trying to test a game now is 10 times greater and harder than it was back then. And like, look at back
Right.
then, all the problems they had back then trying to make these games perfect. It's like, that's why speedrunners can like go through Zelda in like 45 minutes because they found bugs, that originally escaped Nintendo's, observation back then.
Right. And what Nintendo used to require back in the NES and Super NES days is when you submitted the ROMs for approval, you had to give them a videotape of the entire game being played. Because they wanted to make sure the quality was there, and more so to make sure there wasn't any offensive content there. So
Right.
inevitably, the best person to make that videotape was the game tester.
Right.
So they always made the game tape. So if it took you 8 hours to play the game, they sat there for 8 hours and they made the
Yeah.
tape to show every screen and every possible animation and whatnot. And it's ironic how I'm sure testing is much more difficult on those incredibly complex open world games. I can't even imagine, the amount of people. Well, that's why I used to work for a company that was based in India, and we had a whole, team of 30, 40, 50 people that we would contract out to companies to do, testing. Because when you start going to things like PCs, you have different graphic cards, you have different configurations. When you're out of the console area in PC business, there's just a wide variety of things you have to test for that people do not have the same systems that are required. They don't have every graphic card. They don't have even back then it was, what version of the Game Boy do you have? We need to test it on this new version of the Super Nintendo that came out, in the second batch. We'd have different versions of the actual Nintendo hardware to do the testing in to make sure it worked on all the games systems. So, yeah, but testing and the QA department certainly was a great source of people who were helpful in making the games tweaked and fun.
So speaking about having to submit the game for approval, I know the the ESRB came about during the time period that you work in Super NES. Did you have to
Yes.
submit? What was the process? So what was the process like with working with them?
It was pretty easy initially. It was the same kind of thing: sending over a tape, sending over images, sending over paperwork on the game. They would review the actual game and review the tape, and then give you a rating, which you put, or Nintendo, as it were, put on your box, or put on the packaging. It was pretty easy to work with them back in the early days. There weren't too many snafus.
Cool. Okay. So do you have any other favorite stories and memories during this time period, maybe that you want to share?
Let's see. Well, we did a lot of games, and about 1992, I think it was. We were fortunate enough to have a lot of attention from investors, and about that time, we realized that with our current sales and our sales forecasts, we could take the company from a private company to a public company. And so that entails taking a company public, and we signed up with an underwriter group, and Gary and Jim, our head of business and legal, kind of ran the road shows and went around the country raising funds for the company. And eventually we did go public and was on the NASDAQ stock exchange for quite a number of years. There was a funny story where we went to pick up one of the investment checks in New York, and I think Gary and I walked out of the place with a $12 million check.
Wow.
And we went to the car dealership, realized we didn't have enough change between us to get the car out. I think the car garage, to get the car out of the garage, but yet we're holding a $12 million check in his pocket. So that was always fun. No, I had great times during that period. We had a large, after 91, 92, we moved to a larger facility in New Jersey. We had a nice large office space, and we ran the company. At least in my department, creative development, we ran the company as a fun place. And so I was working intimately with a lot of investors and the artists. and the programmers, more so the artists and the QA guys. And we would just have a blast. Like at night, when everybody was gone, we had these, big lab rooms full of cubicles. I would go out during the day and buy these really cool Nerf guns. And
Yeah.
at night, we would turn off all the lights and we'd break up into teams and we'd, run around the office, which was multiple floors and ducking behind various cubicles. And we'd have, Nerf wars. We had some great times. And during that time, we also did a game on the Sega CD with Penn and Teller. And for
Yes.
quite a while, they were in our office doing the filming bits and then doing the design bits. And it was just, it was a really fun, creative time to be making games. And I just have a lot of fond memories of the people I worked with and the things that we enjoyed doing as a group together.
Yeah, that story about that Penn and Teller games, has been like well publicized, by this point, but it's a shame it never came out.
We had finished it. We were one of the things that helped the downfall of our company. I don't want to say helped. One of the things that led to the downfall was that the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis were kind of weaning at that point. The Sega CD had come out to try to save the Genesis. And, the PS1 wasn't really out. And there was, between systems, there sometimes is a lull with, purchasing of games or game buying going on. And so we kind of hit that at the end of the cycle of the Super Nintendo Sega Genesis. We had a few titles that did really poorly. One of the titles that we did that actually was a few years before, I think, but it led badly to our bottom line and our balance sheet, was that we were offered to do a game for a film. And actually the company, the studio wanted to use Gary's Super Battle Tank on the Sega, on the Super Nintendo. And we said, that sounds great. And, we can do that. And the studio said, well, it's a Robin Williams with Barry Levinson as a director, and it's coming out at Christmas. And it's a movie about toys. And we said, wow, that's cool. They said, you want the license for really cheap? We said, sure, yeah, we'll do games based on that brand, and we'll do the games for the movie. And we were not allowed to see any information about the movie. We never got any dailies. And it was kind of all done in secret. We did these games. We, gave the footage to the studio, and we made these, Dave Crane was kind of the lead designer and made games called, based on the movie called Toys. And, we went to the film all excited at the premiere, and we saw the film and we walked out and said, holy crap, that is the biggest piece of crap we think we've ever seen. You'd think Barry Levinson and Robin Williams was going to be hilarious and wonderful. And we made a lot of those games. We made way too many of them. And I remember during that time period, normal game, Toys R Us, that we did was selling, 150 pieces a week. In all the Toys R Us's around the country. I remember when Toys came out, we shipped it and we got our report back a couple of weeks later. How many units are we doing in Toys R Us? Nationwide, I think we sold 6 units. So we sat on a lot of inventory. A few games really drove us into bankruptcy. And during the time we had actually just finished Penn and Teller. The day we received the gold discs back from Sega for the Penn and Teller game, we had to file bankruptcy because one of our factors, which is a company that advances you money when you build games and then you pay them off from the sales of those games, one of the factors got together with another factor, and together they forced us into bankruptcy. We may have been able to save the company if we had been wise to downsize and whatnot, but we never had that opportunity. And I remember the discs for Penn and Teller came in that day, and it was an incredible disappointment to everybody involved, especially a chap who has since passed away, who was a very good friend of my brother and I, who was the main designer of the game, of the overall game, who was very good friends with Penn and Teller, and who really conceived the whole product. I had produced a number of the product components, but he really was the one who was the cheerleader and the leader of the project. He was just devastated. And so, interestingly enough, 20 years later, which was in 2015, I contacted Penn and Teller and spoke to them and tried to negotiate for 6 months the rights to bring Penn and Teller Smoke and Mirrors to the current platforms and to the mobile games. Because I said, we did this game with you. I did it years ago. It never got released. Let's bring it out now. Finally, the game that took 20 years to come out, and we'll dedicate it to our friend Barry, who was the real leader of the game, who was the real guy who conceived it and made it all come together. And after about 6 months of negotiations, they came back and said, we kind of like that the game is in this underground status, because that's really a lot of what they're all about. Underground. And so they said, we don't want to release it at this point. So the game never came to mobile. And I was very pleasantly surprised to see that a comedy group in Canada has the Desert Bus for Hope charity every year. It was so funny. Just around that time in 2015, one of the guys I worked with at another company called Majesco, I kind of had regrouped with him to work together on some projects. And he didn't know the work I had done early in my career. And I told him about Desert Bus, and he came the next day and he said, "Here, my nephew just bought this online, and it was a Desert Bus T-shirt." And I said, "Oh my God, your nephew knows what Desert Bus is." And sure, and I'm very happy to see that the group in Canada has raised millions for children's charity by having the Desert Bus Marathon. So some of the work that we did that never got out actually benefited a lot of people.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive just how many ports of Desert Bus have been made recently. There's even like 2600 version of it out.
There's a 2600 version of it.
Yep.
So done by one of my friends who I met recently. So. Yeah, very cool.